What do we know about the Stanley Cup? I don't doubt for a second that everyone who reads this article keeps in his memory any entertaining story from the history of one of the oldest trophies in world sports and may even share some of them with us in the comments. Several such stories are known to me, and I am ready to share them with you. In my childhood, I learned the story of the origin of the Stanley Cup, in which for a long time I piously believed myself and devoted friends and acquaintances. The story goes like this. The Governor-General of Canada, Lord Stanley, on his way to a hockey game, thought long and hard about how to witness his presence at a game that was gaining more and more popularity in his governorship. Finally, he went to a china shop and bought a silver salad bowl for 25 baht. That salad bowl went down in history, eventually earning a name of its own, the Stanley Cup. Further in the article from which I got this information once, it was said that nowadays, and this is somewhere between 70s and 80s, you can't buy even the cheapest ticket to a Stanley Cup game for $25. And so, I told this story for many years, changing in it a couple of times only the name of the means of payment, or rather, the currency. Soon realizing that the case is not in the United States, but in Canada, I began to say that the salad bowl cost 25 shillings and then pounds sterling. Perhaps, and why not? Some of you have read or heard this story. Forget it. It was almost like that, but not quite. Or rather, it wasn't like that at all. If you happen to be in Toronto on May 15th, the year doesn't matter, rush to the Hockey Hall of Fame. On that day, the very cup that Lord Stanley got for 25s from the museum's vault is on display for all to see. You can pour champagne into the bowl, sip sparkling drink, and maybe, like Patrick Roy, fill it with popcorn, or like Evgeny Kuznetsov, eat dumplings from it. And you can even, like Lester Patrick, use it as a headdress. Are you buying it? The maximum you will be allowed is to be photographed next to the cup. They won't even let you touch it. There are now 3 official Stanley Cups in the world. One is in the custody of the winning team. Gary Bettman officially presents it to the champions. They raise it above their heads, organize championship parades with it, eat dumplings from it, drink. Whoever pours what? Feed dogs from it, bathe children in it in general. Put the duplicate into a lot of stressful situations. Another duplicate is on display in the stained glass window of the Hockey Hall of Fame, but the original is kept in the same place, in the Hockey Hall, but in a special vault behind 7 locks and is brought out into the light of God only on May 15th. Why May 15th? It was on this day in 1893 that the silver salad bowl was first presented to the public. The presentation took place in Montreal, but even before the presentation, after which the salad bowl ceased to be a kitchen utensil and stepped into the category of sports trophies. The cup was followed by a trail of confusions and scandals. Well, scandals in these times, it's like a good portion of good seasoning in any cooking, but with the confusions, let's try to understand. I can assume that after reading this essay, some of you will question the information of this opus, because with the data from Wikipedia, it somewhat diverges. Nevertheless, I will insist on its authenticity, because I relied on the works of very authoritative Canadian, I emphasize Canadian, hockey publications. So, back in 1892, Lord Baron Frederick Stanley of Preston, Earl of Derby, Governor-General of Canada. Don't think it's a triumvirate, it's one person, inspired by visiting hockey battles in his province, declared his desire to establish a hockey prize. Any Canadian will tell you this, it's they pass it in school like 2 times 2. He didn't buy the silver salad bowl at the store. It was made to order in London, the capital of the metropolis. I question the means of payment listed on Wikipedia as guineas. By that time, guineas had already gone out of official circulation. However, all sorts of counts and barons had such a hype to pay among themselves in gold guineas, exactly among themselves, and exactly in gold. However, there were no other guineas, so I will not insist that there were no guineas at all. In early 1893, the order was completed, packed in a mahogany case and shipped to Canada, where it arrived in April. However, along with the cup, in the same month, from the British Isles, Lord Stanley received sad news. In his homeland died his brother, Lord Stanley, Earl of Derby 15th, and Stanley Frederick will have to return to the foggy Albion to inherit. In other words, with the Stanley Cup arriving in Canada, Lord Stanley has absolutely no time to attend to his brainchild. So the Earl of Derby XVI makes a simple and effective decision. He appoints a Cup Board of Trustees. 2 of the members of the board were Philip Ross and John Sweetland. Both were from Ottawa. Understandably so. Lord Stanley's residence was, of course, in the capital. Both were very prominent public men. At the time of becoming Baron Stanley's confidant, Phil Ross was the owner, publisher, and editor-in-chief of the Ottawa Evening Journal. Moreover, a few years before that, he had become co-owner of that publication, which was going under. However, at the time of the described events, the Ottawa Evening Journal, thanks to the efforts of Ross, was already one of the leading publications in Canada. In the future, Ross had a brilliant career as a politician. But in retrospect, Phil Ross graduated from McGill State University in Montreal, where he was closely and quite successfully engaged in various sports. For example, he was a participant in the first soccer match. Soccer, the correction for the United States, is mandatory, between the national teams of Canada and the United States in 1878. Here it should be said, of course, that the national teams were formed on the basis of the university teams of McGill and Harvard. With Lord Stanley's son Edward, Philip Ross played hockey for the Rideau Rebels team. So we can assume that he was in the house of the Governor General's family. Speaking of the Rebels, Rideau is a district in Ottawa that was the official residence of the British monarchs and the Governor General of Canada. Sir Stanley built a hockey rink here at the insistent request of his son. The name Rebels was a kind of youthful challenge, or maybe someone thus glittered wit, rebels in the residence of kings. In the future, the franchise would go down a rather interesting path, changing names while being at the forefront of Canadian hockey, and would one day fall into Phil Ross's sphere of interest and become known as the Senators. Yes, the Senators, who were at the origins of the NHL, four-time Stanley Cup winners, prehistoric, that is, the times before the NHL I do not take into account, and whose name was inherited by the current NHL franchise from the glorious city of Ottawa. And as the cherry on the cake, Philip Ross, a member of the Hockey Hall of Fame since 1976 in the builders category. John Sweetland was a prominent physician of his time. But in 1893, when referring to this man, one would say, Sheriff Dr. Sweetland or Judge Dr. Sweetland. That is, you see that his authority transcended the boundaries of ordinary medical practice and forced the doc to shoulder two difficult positions. These two honorable citizens of the city of Ottawa, Lord Stanley entrusted to be the trustees of the prize of his name. However, at that time the trophy, not yet as honorable as it is today, was called something else. Namely, the Dominion Hockey Challenge Cup. Why so? I do not have an unambiguous version. So, Lord Stanley is busy preparing for the handover to his successor, the Earl of Aberdeen. Canada, you understand, is not a small country. Just trees, wow, try to count, and plus moose, deer, and other game. The Lord, by the way, by the evidence of contemporaries, was known as an avid and not unsuccessful hunter. And then in the minds of the trustees crept the idea to make the first awarding of the cup right now. To make, so to speak, respect to the Lord. Because at that time, you understand, to travel from Britain to Canada only for the awarding of the prize is a dubious pleasure. And whether there will be such an opportunity, looking ahead I will say because it turned out so, Baron Stanley was not present at any awarding of the Stanley Cup. The idea is controversial, let's face it, because it's the month of May, and the season is long over. But it would certainly be a feel-good moment for Lord. If a winner cannot be determined, one could be appointed. The choice fell on the Champion Amateur Hockey Association of Canada, the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association Club. And here the first scandal awaited the prize. The fact is that the champion in the ANA was revealed not in the playoffs, but in the regular championship. In the last round, the Mayaya Club met with another Montreal team, the Crystals. The main time ended in a draw. In extra time, the Crystals were angered by the fact that the MAA team had a player on the court who had been suspended in regulation time, and the penalty time had not yet expired. They appealed to the referee, but he ignored their message. Then, in protest, the Crystals left the court. The May-A were awarded a technical victory and were declared champions. The Crystals had no aspirations for high places, and all would have been fine, but if the May-A had lost that match, the championship would have been shared by the two teams. And according to the additional indicators, the champions would have been the Montrealers vis-a-vis, HC Ottawa. So simply, without pathos, already called Rideau Rebels. And here, the story is confusing, dark without a single highlighter, and I couldn't untangle it. No, officially everything is simple in any reference book you will find. The first owners of the Stanley Cup. Ma! But we're talking about HC Ottawa, whose player just 2 years ago was Phil Ross, a member of the Cup's Board of Trustees. Moreover, in his memoirs, Lord Stanley recalls that things were so busy that I was not prepared to be away even for a day, not even to Montreal. One day it was flashed that the cup would be awarded in Ottawa. I was ready for that, but then things quieted down, and I didn't care about the cup. I am inclined to believe that the trustees wanted to fudge the results of the championship, but I will not insist on it. One day in the second decade of May, A respectable middle-aged man stepped off the train from Ottawa onto the platform of the Montreal station. In addition to the usual traveling valise, his luggage included a substantial mahogany case. This was the sheriff of Carleton County and part-time delegate of Lord Stanley, Dr. Sweetland. The annual general meeting of the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association was scheduled for May 15th, during which John Sweetland intended to make a presentation of the cup and present it to the members of the hockey team. The epical event, from the height of time, seemed to its participants moderately festive and moderately routine, especially considering that Lord Stanley himself would not be able to attend the meeting due to a heavy workload. Routine? As if not. The intentions of the Challenge Cup Board of Trustees were notified to the IAA management in advance by telegram. The association secretary relayed the gist of the telegram, or maybe the telegram itself, to the hockey section president and part-time team player James Stewart. And tell them to wear ties, or they'll show up in sweatpants. You're going to a meeting, not a picnic. Do you think the secretary said that to Stewart or not? I think he did, because it's the only thing that explains the outbreak of nihilism that erupted at the meeting. However, as Stephen Smith, a highly respected Canadian hockey publicist, aptly pointed out, there were no reports in the Montreal newspapers the next day about the fight at the sports club, which means that everything ended in an orderly and decent manner. It did, and it began. No, everything started the same way, nice and decent. The trophy went out into the world. It was on public display. Club members and invited guests could not only appreciate the work of London jewelers, but also take a photo near the cup as a souvenir. I remind, it was May 15th, 1893. It is from this day, the chronicle of the Stanley Cup. Dr. John Sweetland then invited James Stewart to come out and receive the cup. Stewart went out. Now there are many versions, I emphasize versions, who said what to whom and what he heard in response. We will never know the exact exchange of opinions. We will not know what, or maybe who, prompted the hockey players to be impertinent. But the dialogue was like this. We refuse to accept this cup until we familiarize ourselves with the rules of regulations for this trophy. You see, Sir Stanley. So tell that to Sir Stanley. But Sir Stanley, have him send the regulations in writing, in triplicate. We'll read it and decide whether or not to take the prize. The situation was resolved by the MAIA president James Taylor, who flew on stage and received the unfortunate trophy from Sweetland's hands. It was with such a scandal that the famous cup went to life. The discussion on elevated tones continued for some time, and it threatened not only to drag on, but also to go into a forceful phase. But then one of the hockey players was awarded an individual prize more usual for those olden days. Tom Payton, the goalie of the hockey team, who stood at the origins of the MAA, in the continuation of the solemn part, was awarded a Heinzmann piano. You have to agree. What a thing. By the way, I'm not kidding here at all. Look in the top 25 most expensive things in the world. You will find a piano from Heinzmann, a very reputable company. And here's another, by the way. It's said that championship rings were the first to be awarded in the NBA. But although much has remained hidden from us behind the shadows of time, it is known that at that meeting, 9 players of the champion team were given gold rings with engraving. A few days later, Dr. Sweetland and Philip Ross arrived at Lord Stanley's residence. They had already drafted the regulations and needed to settle some details with the Baron. The 16th Earl of Derby was concerned, you bet. Someone had sorted brown and white bears, and there was such confusion. And Baron Aberdeen is so meticulous. How was the presentation? Can you imagine, sir? Tell me later, Doc, sometime. I need you both, and here's why. The Yankees and I never got around to demarcating the Yukon border, and there's a gold rush going on. Frederick Stanley would not leave for the metropolis until July. He sailed with a clear conscience and peace of mind. All herds of elk and herds of salmon had been counted and recounted, as well as new bridges, miles of roads, telegraph lines, and power lines. Equipment of port facilities both on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Great work on the St. Lawrence River, which is becoming an increasingly important link in the transportation structure of North America. A step forward was made in the field of education with the opening of new educational institutions. And the border demarcation along the gold-bearing Yukon has moved forward. And the Challenge Cup? The Baron hardly remembered it. Would posterity remember him for that?